Today on the New Brunswick Today Show, it's the battle over New Brunswick's paid sick leave law continuing. We'll have a full recap of what went down at last night's very special City Council meeting. We're also going to be broadcasting here from our studio for the next hour. We'll be taking your calls, 732-993-9697. Please check out our website and read some of the great stories on there, newbrunswicktoday.com. We look forward to having you start your day with us every morning here on the New Brunswick Today Show. It is a beautiful morning here in downtown New Brunswick. Today's supposed to be cloudy early with peaks of sunshine expected late. High is going to be 86 degrees Fahrenheit. The winds are going to be blowing to the north between 10 and 15 miles an hour. A couple traffic advisories for today, Wednesday, September 7th. Sanford Street is going to be closed between Joyce Kilmer Avenue and Livingston Avenue until 4 p.m. And Wilcox Road is going to be closed again for sewer construction there until 5 p.m. Thanks so much for joining us today. We've got a great show planned for you. Our guest today is Jason Rowe from Unity Square, a local community organization here. Some of the top officials from New Jersey law enforcement are actually going to be on the Rutgers campus today for a press event. Attorney General Christopher Perino, along with the state's Chief Technology Officer, the Director of the Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, the Director of the New Jersey Division of Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and Rutgers officials are teaming up to announce the implementation of a new initiative, a text-to-911 system that is going to allow people to text 911. They're also introducing a promotional video to drive home the important message of call when you can, but text when you can't. So text to 911 is going to allow people to contact emergency services for assistance by text instead of voice calling. And the reason Rutgers is hosting the event and helping roll it out is not just to reach its own community and staff, faculty, and students, but also to highlight the university's role, because they're going to be dispatching all of the text to 911 messages for residents of Middlesex County. Representatives of the New Jersey Division of Deaf and Hard of Hearing will be on hand to highlight efforts to alert those with hearing loss that they can now reach emergency assistance through the text to 911 system. Senator Robert Menendez is also going to be on the Rutgers campus today at the School of Social Work to celebrate something awesome. The Daniel Jordan Fiddle Foundation is the nation's first not-for-profit organization to focus exclusively on adult autism, and they're going to be presenting a check for $100,000 to the Rutgers School of Social Work in order for them to establish a groundbreaking endowment fund. Sad news on Labor Day, a man was killed near the border between Franklin Township and North Brunswick. Acting prosecutor Michael Robertson said that detectives have ascertained Mr. Joseph Cardbo and Isaiah J. Bell, also known as Ike, were involved in a physical altercation in the area of Coventry Lane and Westminster Road. After the altercation, Bell fled from the area in a four-door sedan, and Mr. Cardbo, unfortunately, entered his vehicle, in which his 6-year-old son was sitting in, and attempted to drive onto Route 27, but he got in a crash. Mr. Cardbo's vehicle was crashed into a medical building. So acting prosecutor Robertson said that the 6-year-old was not injured in the crash, and he was released to a family member. Yesterday morning, a post-mortem examination was conducted on Mr. Cardbo by the New Jersey Northern Regional Medical Examiner's Office in Newark, and the cause of his death was determined to be homicide by sharp force injury to his chest. Detectives are searching for Ike Bell, Isaiah Bell, who's been charged with first-degree murder, and those detectives are urging him to surrender to law enforcement authorities. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office Major Crimes Unit at 908-231-7100. As promised, we have obtained the official list of candidates that filed to run for mayor and city council in the city of Perth Amboy. The deadline for those candidates that filed their petitions to get their names on the ballot was yesterday. Not a surprise, incumbent Mayor Wilda Diaz is among those candidates. She had the most signatures on her petitions of all the candidates who had submitted. Now, Diaz had allegedly said she was not going to run for a third term before changing her mind. But others in the city think it's time for her to leave office, as evidenced by the 3 candidates who have thrown their hats into the ring for the Bay City's highest office. Those are Sharon Huberman, Miguel Nunez, and City Councilman Joel Pabon. Now, there's also 2 seats up on the City Council, up for grabs in the same election, along with 3 seats on the city's Board of Education. Those elections are going to be held on November 8th, the same day as the presidential election. Now, Mayor Diaz is going to be running along with 2 candidates for City Council, Helmin Caba and Fernando Irizarry. Huberman's only has 1 council candidate as her running mate, Enid Crespo. And Nunez will be running alongside council candidates Virginia Lugo and Miriam Quiles Figueroa. Pabon will be joined on a ticket with council candidates Angel Mota Ramirez and Kenneth Puccio. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do this live broadcast tomorrow, and I want to tell you why. It's because of the Middlesex County Tax Board. The state has been cracking down on them, saying that the 4-member board, which is responsible for handling tax appeals and other tax-related matters in the county, they said that it is shirking its constitutional responsibility by not requiring towns to do what we call revaluation. And they've said that the commissioners have demonstrated a, quote, astonishing lack of confidence. So strong words from the state. Now, unlike most government boards, these are actually paid positions. So the board members make about $20,000 a year for their service. One of the commissioners is City Council President Kevin Egan. And so we'll be talking about him a little later today. But you might remember him as the first official in decades to be fined for violating the city's code of ethics. Yours truly filed the complaint after we caught him red-handed last year, failing to disclose he was a partner in a rental property here in New Brunswick. So we're trying to find out what's going on at the tax board. We wanted to ask these guys some questions. We went to the August 12th meeting to try to get some answers. And well, out of the 4 members making those 5-figure salaries, only 1 showed up. So after the meeting, we went up to Michael Lax, the only board member who showed up, and asked what his response was to the comments coming out of the state government about his board. Here's how that conversation went.
Thanks, how are you? Charlie Cradaville, New Brunswick Today newspaper. A few questions for you. I wanted to know.
We didn't have any cases concerning New Brunswick.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you, though, do you have any response to what the Treasury Department has said about the tax board?
I have no idea. I know there was something with appeals, but I don't, generally, the president of the board speaks and comments on behalf of the board. That's generally been our policy. So,
okay.
I'm not sure what I have no idea what there was some stuff in papers about it. It could be, I don't even know. So.
Okay, you're not familiar with the comments that the Treasury Department made?
About?
It said the board had repeated failures to provide proper oversight, and that members have demonstrated astonishing lack of competence by ignoring their constitutional obligation.
Always recognize my constitutional obligation in anything that I do. So me personally, I live by one standard, and I do the best I can do with anything I do, and I follow the law.
So you think they're incorrect?
I don't know. I'm not saying anything. I don't know the frame of reference, what they're talking about, or anything else.
Regarding revaluations, Middlesex has not forced any towns to do revals in more than 20 years, they said. And,
no, there's been revals. There's been plenty of revals in this. But again, I don't
you
speak
haven't
on
ordered
behalf.
a town to
I don't
conduct an
speak,
involuntary revaluation.
I don't speak on behalf of the board. So
okay.
The president of the board and the administration does.
Okay, that's Mr. Lorenzen?
Yes.
And then
yes.
There's Mr. Egan, and is Mr. Haney is the other member? Or?
Yes.
Okay, and is it true he's being replaced?
I don't know.
Okay.
That's,
I believe the governor appointed me.
If the governor made an appointment, it has to go through the legislature until those things happen. There's been other people who've been appointed in the past, and then they didn't end up being board members for whatever reason it is. So until the day, they're approved.
Understood.
Yeah.
And who's in charge of replacing Mr. Verislav? I know he's put in his retirement papers.
That's an interesting question, because we haven't had it come up in so long.
Sure.
So he's been here for, He's had that job for better than 15 years.
Sure.
So I'm pretty sure the board has like a approval authority on it. Who exactly hires that person, I'm not exactly sure.
Okay, I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, I don't know, that's probably a statutory thing on how that works.
Sure, I'll look into it. And then the last question is just, what do you do for a living?
I work for, as a property manager.
Property manager?
Yeah.
For whom?
For a company in Bergen County.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And you're from EB?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Now, we actually looked up Mr. Lax and saw that he's actually listed as the Director of Finance and Investments for the STRO companies based in Ridgewood, New Jersey. Now, the reason we're not going to be able to do the show tomorrow is because the Middlesex County Tax Board is having another meeting finally. So we're going to be there, and we're going to try to take the opportunity to ask the board members questions. As you can see, they kind of just brush off the criticism from the state. So we're really going to try to go there and hold their feet to the fire. That meeting is tomorrow at some ungodly hour, I think 8:30 in the morning. They'll be meeting at the lower level of the Middlesex County building here in downtown, right across the street from our lovely studios. So that's where we'll be tomorrow. We won't be doing a show for you tomorrow, but come back and join us Friday morning at 9 a.m. for the New Brunswick Today show. And please keep joining us. So last night's city council meeting, we learned quite a bit, including about the story we brought you yesterday of Travis Holfish, who's the latest employee at the New Brunswick Water Utility to be suspended. We just learned last night at the council meeting that Holfish is now facing additional discipline for an unrelated incident, an incident unrelated to the one that he has already gone through a disciplinary hearing for. We saw that he was disciplined, he was suspended, but he's already, again, facing new disciplinary charges. And for what, we don't know. We tried to ask, and you can watch that council meeting video when that comes out on the city's website later today. We were also able to get some answers to questions about last week's shooting in New Brunswick. As we reported, there was a daytime shooting in the parking lot of the Aldi on Route 27 here. It injured 2 people. Captain J.T. Miller confirmed that the New Brunswick Housing Authority headquarters building at Van Dyke Avenue was struck by a stray bullet in the incident that did send those 2 people to the hospital. John Clark, the executive director of the Housing Authority, still hasn't responded to our inquiries from last week. Now, we have a photo that we showed you last week. Captain Miller was unable to confirm whether this photo taken at St. Peter's University Hospital, SPUH, was related to the shooting or not. We heard from several sources that that was the car where the victims were being transported to the hospital, and they actually took out a traffic light at that corner on the other side of town shortly after the shooting. At last night's council meeting, Captain Miller said he wasn't ready to confirm whether this crash was at all related to the shooting, which is, as he said, still under investigation. But now, on to our top story. So when the City Council approved its meeting schedule for 2016, their first meeting in September was supposed to be tonight. But instead of a normal, regular City Council meeting tonight, we had a very special, very unique, very strange, very interesting discussion last night that in some ways had a feeling of deja vu all over again. It all started with a New Brunswick Today article published on November 30th of last year. NBT reporter Sarah Beth Kay reported that the City Council was finally going to consider a paid sick leave law, something that advocates had been pushing for years. But statewide groups that had been pushing similar policies in other New Jersey cities felt like they were left out of the discussion. And when they saw that article, they tried to join the discussion, but they soon found themselves on the outside looking in. Compromises had already been made, and the powers that be, New Brunswick's mayor and council, weren't ready to go back to the drawing board, and neither were the partners who had been with them at the table. So now it's important to note it did take a long time to get the City Council and the mayor to address the issue of paid sick leave. So you could understand why the local advocates who've been pushing day in and day out for this reform at the municipal level wouldn't want to delay the process any further. But the Working Families Alliance and other statewide groups also made some good points, raising valid concerns over a number of compromises that had been worked into the proposed legislation here in New Brunswick. So paid sick leave is important not just for workers, but for the general public. The goal is to keep diseases from spreading, from people from getting sick. Now, nowhere is this threat more serious than in hospitals. But of course, under the law that New Brunswick passed, temporary and per diem hospital workers in both of New Brunswick's major hospitals are specifically exempted from the law. No doubt about it. It was a compromise with some of the city's biggest businesses that limits the impact of the law on them and restricts dozens or perhaps more workers from getting the benefits of paid sick time. We tried to ask how many workers would be affected at last night's council meeting. Couldn't get an exact answer. Now, the statewide groups had also raised a lot of heck over the exemptions that required restaurant workers to get doctor's notes if they were going to take a sick day on certain holidays. Now, the fact that the ordinance didn't treat part-time and full-time workers equally was also troubling. Not only does the ordinance currently allow full-time workers to accumulate paid sick leave at a greater rate than their part-time colleagues, but for those who work less than 20 hours a week at one job, you're out of luck. No guaranteed sick days at all unless your employer wants to give them to you. So I asked the council last night, what about people who hold 2 part-time jobs that are both less than 20 hours? What about people who hold 3 part-time jobs that are less than 20 hours each? The answer, no sick leave for those workers. Another troubling provision, it was probably well-intentioned, companies with less than 5 people on the payroll are also exempt from needing to give their workers paid sick days under this law. The goal obviously is to spare small businesses from what is a significant financial burden. But of course, this can disincentivize a company from hiring that 5th or 6th employee, and creative accounting can even make it so employees actually work for different companies even if they're working at the same location, essentially providing a bit of a loophole for employers to avoid giving the benefit to their employees. These issues have led to some tension at council meetings last year, and this is what last night's meeting was reminiscent of, tension between activists who usually see eye to eye. Ultimately, the law was passed with the exemptions included, but groups like the NJ Working Families Alliance didn't stop pushing for a stronger law that would cover all workers. And to that end, they actually went out and got signatures and submitted an official petition to repeal and replace the existing law and replace it with a modified version that would basically end these exemptions that they were opposed to. Now, the council opted to move their meeting up by 1 day in order to comply with the requirement that they had to hold a public hearing on this within 20 days of the proposal being certified. So, oddly enough, 2 of the 5 council members didn't show up for last night's meeting, even though they themselves had voted to set the date and time for the special meeting just 3 weeks earlier. Now, Betsy Garlotti, she was the one who did not vote for the original paid sick leave ordinance. Back when it came up for a vote last December, Garlotti abstained, citing, among other things, that she was afraid it might cause temporary agencies to leave town. Garlotti is also on her way out of office as she's opted not to run for re-election. Now, Rebecca Escobar, on the other hand, was just re-elected in 2014, and her absence last night was unexplained. So what ended up happening was there were only 3 council members left, and they all voted against the proposal for the modified version of the paid sick leave law, opting instead to let voters decide in November, on the November 8th election, the same day we vote for president. We're going to be asked in New Brunswick, yes or no, on this new version of the paid sick leave law. Now, we learned a lot last night at that council meeting, and we'll have more coverage for you on Friday once we get our hands on the video from it. But I do want to give you guys just the basic rundown of what the power structure is saying. Basically, the folks who are supporting this law from inside the city administration had a lot to say last night. They defended the existing law. They attacked, in many ways, the proposed changes. And we have a video of exactly what the city's planning director said at last night's meeting. It might be a little boring, but stick with it. And when we come back, we're going to have an interview with Jason Rowe. He is one of the advocates who fought to pass the original law, and we're going to discuss last night and discuss his organization, discuss what they're doing, what their position is. But for now, watch this video of Glenn Patterson explaining the current sick leave law and the impact the petition from the Working Families Alliance has. By the way, he calls it the Workers' Families Party incorrectly. He meant to say Working Families Alliance. Here's the video. We'll be right back with Jason Rowe.
As you know, back in January, the city passed a sick pay ordinance, and it has been in effect since April of this year. It covers the vast majority of workers in the city of New Brunswick who are in firms with 5 or more employees, and has different tiers as to the number of hours that persons would earn. One of the unique portions of our ordinance is that it covers the temporary health service firm workers who are transported out of town. These are the employment agency workers who may work for an agency here in town, but might actually be physically working in Cranberry or Edison or someplace like that. So we have had this ordinance in effect now for about 5 months. We've had 14 complaints or preliminary complaints come into our office. To date, our sick pay administrator, Maria Cody, has been trying to mediate those with the employers and the employees. It's been successful in most of those, and some of them are still ongoing. Subsequent to that, the Workers' Family Party has introduced an ordinance to replace the city's existing sick pay ordinance. And this ordinance deletes the language that provides for the temporary health service workers who are transported out of town to be covered. That was in section 3.6 of our ordinance, and that language is deleted. The Workers' Family Party has gotten sick pay ordinances adopted in a number of towns in New Jersey. They've decided to go after a town-by-town strategy to promote sick pay in the state of New Jersey. The city of New Brunswick agreed to support that idea, and we came up with a formula that we felt best fit the city of New Brunswick. Our language differed a little bit from what they had in some of the other towns, but generally covers the vast majority of the workers here in New Brunswick. So one of the things we covered was the temporary health service workers. We also included safe times for persons who are dealing with domestic violence issues. In their ordinance, they picked up that unique language that we had, and they put that in their petition.
So we had that first. We were the
Yes.
first. We were the first municipality to adopt that ordinance, that particular.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
In crafting this ordinance, we worked with local community activists such as Unity Square and Esperanza. We talked to local businesses, both big businesses and small businesses, and we got a number of our local government people together to work through this ordinance to try to craft it to fit New Brunswick's specific situation. The ordinance that is being proposed by petition, however, the petitioners did not discuss that with local government. As far as I know, they didn't reach out to the community activists that we talked to, Unity Square and Esperanza. Didn't talk to the business community in town. So it ended up having some, what we believe are errors in it, where workers that we are covering, who are a significant portion of our workforce and are the most vulnerable part of our workforce, would not be covered under their ordinance. So that is what is being proposed there. There has been, I know, some discussion, and may have been some last-minute discussion. I know Mr. Shanley was talking with some of their representatives about amending the language of the petition ordinance. Looking at the statute and looking at some case law, we don't believe that the council has the power to do that. Section 186 of the statute says that the circulated petition has to include the full text of the proposed ordinance. So if you change the ordinance, it's that ordinance that then goes to the voters isn't what the people who signed the petition signed up for. You can't read the petitioners' minds to know why exactly they signed that. And if you allow the council to make changes to what the petitioner signed, that is a very slippery slope. It's not only something that this group might want to expand what is under their current ordinance who would be covered, but also allow the council to make other changes that the petitioners may not agree with. So there was a court case on this that the appellate division came down with about 2 years ago in a Jackson Township case, where they talked about how the Faulkner Act, which is what the city is organized under state statute, that act has strong policies protecting the initiative and referendum process, so that you can't change what the petitioners sign when they are, or the people who are signing the petitions sign, so that they don't sign one thing and then there's not a bait and switch and they get something later. And the court, in that case, said the court didn't have the power to make those kinds of substantive changes to the act. They can only act on something where it was jurisdictional or prima facie against the law. The same rationale applies to the city council. You don't believe you have the power to make those kinds of changes. And it's probably a good thing that you don't, because then people can't play with what petitioners circulated and what people signed. So that's where we are tonight. I guess we'll hear some opposing opinions to that.
Thank you, Mr. Bagley.
As you know, back in January, the city passed a sick pay ordinance, and it has been in effect since April of this year. It covers the vast majority of workers in the city of New Brunswick who are in firms with 5 or more employees, and has different tiers as to the number of hours that persons would earn. One of the unique portions of our ordinance is that it covers the temporary health service firm workers who are transported out of town. These are the employment agency workers. They work for an agency here in town, but might actually be physically working in Cranberry or Edison or someplace like that. So we have had this ordinance in effect now for about 5 months. We've had 14 complaints or preliminary complaints come into our office. To date, our sick pay administrator, Maria Cody, has been trying to mediate those with the employers and the employees. It's been successful in most of those, and some of them are still ongoing. Subsequent to that, the Workers' Family Party has introduced an ordinance to replace the city's existing sick pay ordinance. And this ordinance deletes the language that provides for the temporary health service workers who are transported out of town to be covered. That was in section 3.6 of our ordinance, and that language is deleted. The Workers' Family Party has gotten sick pay ordinances adopted in a number of towns in New Jersey. They've decided to go after a town-by-town strategy to promote sick pay in the state of New Jersey. The city of New Brunswick agreed to support that idea, and we came up with a formula that we felt best fit the city of New Brunswick. Our language differed a little bit from what they had in some of the other towns, but generally covers the vast majority of the workers here in New Brunswick. So one of the things we covered was the temporary health service workers. We also included safe time for persons who are dealing with domestic violence issues. In their ordinance, they picked up that unique language that we had, and they put that in their petition.
So we had that first. We were the
Yes.
first. We were the first municipality to adopt that ordinance, that particular.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
In crafting this ordinance, we worked with local community activists such as Unity Square and Esperanza. We talked to local businesses, both big businesses and small businesses, and we got a number of our local government people together to work through this ordinance to try to craft it to fit New Brunswick's specific situation. The ordinance that is being proposed by petition, however, the petitioners did not discuss that with local government. As far as I know, they didn't reach out to the community activists that we talked to, Unity Square and Esperanza. Didn't talk to the business community in town. So it ended up having some, what were errors in it, where work.
Welcome back to the New Brunswick Today Show. That was Glenn Patterson going through the paid sick leave law that's on the books and the way that this whole other option, other ordinance is coming forward. But right now we're joined by Jason Rowe from Unity Square, a great community organization here in New Brunswick. We're proud to partner with you, and thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Hey, a pleasure. I'm glad to be here in one of your inaugural episodes.
Thanks. So before we get to what happened last night, tell the people at home a little bit about you and what your organization does, what you stand for, what you fight for.
Sure. So Unity Square is a community organization based here in New Brunswick. We're part of Catholic Charities of the Diocese of McCutcheon, and we focus on kind of community empowerment, community building, community development. And so the things that we've really kind of focused on is one, kind of developing community members from our target community who tend to be just with demographics, Hispanic immigrants, adults who have young children, working folks, right? Because we're a community of working families, right? People are employed, people are working hard, helping them develop leadership so that they can take action on things that are important to them. And that really are things that kind of address like their economic standing. Housing is a huge issue, as well as things related to quality of life in the city. We also run a community center in the old firehouse on Remsen Ave, where we have a whole host of programs from like youth science enrichment to English as a second language. Some of the stuff that we've prominently worked on has included getting the New Brunswick anti-wage theft law passed and implemented. And so, every year around Thanksgiving, we help get thousands of dollars in unpaid wages back into people's hands, as well as the changes to Livingston Avenue that were made, I guess now, almost a year and a half, 2 years ago, 2 springs ago. Actually 2 years ago, right? Because it was 2 springs ago, to make it more safe for pedestrians following the unfortunate accident that kind of galvanized the community to really finally take action on the street that we've long known has been unsafe.
Hard to cross. Yeah. So, and you've also put together candidate forums for Board of Education.
Right.
Other issues of community interest.
I mean, we could do a whole show where I could list sort of the different things we do. But yeah, things that involve the community and making it better and really trying to put community leaders first. And so, it's kind of a new experience for me even to be talking in this respect, because if you've ever seen us as a council, I don't think I've ever addressed the council as myself. I've always done it, translating for someone else, and that's just kind of indicative of our philosophy.
Right. Well, thank you for joining us today. I want to talk a little bit about that movement that was built around wage theft and how that was a prelude to basically the second law that you got the council to pass 2 years after that first law. Tell people why wage theft was an issue and how you guys tackled it.
Sure. So, one of the things that we found with our community, I think this is indicative of the Hispanic community in New Brunswick, is that, the folks are working, but they're in bad jobs, right? And they're in bad, and these jobs are bad for a lot of reasons. But they're rife with abuse and potential for abuse. And so we kind of use a diverse set of means to try to make these bad jobs good, or help people get into better jobs, right? And so one of the things we were finding with wage theft is that it's sort of like a very basic principle of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work was not happening in the city of New Brunswick. Well, across the state, but particularly in New Brunswick, we're getting people who were working very hard, working tremendous hours, and were not getting paid for all their hours. They're not getting paid overtime, even though they were working 50, 60 hours a week. And not only that, but then we're working with ourselves or our partner organizations that we work very closely with, like New Labor, winning wage theft judgments against employers, and then having employers not pay those judgments.
So the bosses would lose the case, they'd find that they owe the worker money, and then the worker still wouldn't be able to collect.
Yeah, exactly. And so the premise of the wage theft ordinance was a simple one that for a lot of businesses, we saw kind of a local mechanism for enforcement. And that was the fact that for restaurants and for kind of mercantile businesses, the city of New Brunswick is in charge of issuing these licenses. Yeah, and they're renewed on an annual basis. And so basically we updated the law and licenses to say, listen, if you owe a worker money and it's not a dispute because
Right.
you've
You
already
lost the
gone to the
case.
Department of Labor, you've lost. Guess what? You got to pay them, and if you haven't, you're not getting a license. And the restaurant license, I mentioned Thanksgiving before. The restaurant licenses usually renew the 1st of December, right? And so usually the Friday after Thanksgiving, which is not a city holiday, so city hall is open, is the last day that businesses can get in and show documentation to City Clerk Dan Teresi that they have paid their wage theft judgments. And so the day after Thanksgiving is when we see, employers that have made excuses about not paying a cent or not having money to pay judgment for a whole year, coming up with $7,000-$8,000 to pay, because guess what? They're not going to have a restaurant that's going to be open.
Right, they won't be
the
able to
next
do
day.
that.
Yeah, and so it's been tremendously effective in that respect.
So, something that's really fascinating about this whole, I don't know what to call it, but this whole recent discussion
Right.
about paid sick leave is that some of the folks who were part of the movement to pass the wage theft reforms a few years earlier are now kind of at odds with the city and with your organization. And like, for instance, Craig Garcia was formerly of New Labor, now with Working Families. He spoke up last night at the council meeting and said that the compromises that had been reached were pitting workers against one another, or pitting these activists, people
Right.
whose heart are in the right place, pitting them against each other.
So
What's your
so let
response
me-
to that? You didn't speak at the meeting last night, but I want to hear what you.
I translated. I tell you, the council should know how to say buenas tardes and hola, gracias very well, because I heard it a lot. So two things. One, every organization and every community member that has supported, that pushed for the wage theft ordinance, also pushed for the earned sick leave ordinance, and is against this petition that's going to amend it. There's one person who was in a professional position, who has gone on to another professional role, who you mentioned, who is the sole person. But with the groups that are in New Brunswick and the people that are in New Brunswick, for example, you had, I can name folks like Ines Garcia, Renata Cruz, all folks who spoke on wage theft, all spoke in favor of the current law. And there's a reason for that. So in your introduction, you talked about, you characterized Working Families as presenting a petition that covers all workers. That's actually not true, and that's the main point of contention. The New Brunswick, the current New Brunswick earned sick leave law is very specific because it covers employees of temporary health service firms, or I'll call them staffing agencies because that's how they're known colloquially.
Right, and this is thousands of workers.
Thousands of workers. We're talking about like maybe 3,800, maybe 4,000 workers. Temporary health service firms that are based in New Brunswick and transport employees outside the city of New Brunswick. They're a huge part of the local economy. 1 in 10 New Brunswick residents that are in the workforce, and 1 in 8 New Brunswick residents that work in the private sector workforce, which is what this ordinance only pertains to, work through these temporary health service firms. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the agencies, what they do is they're based in New Brunswick. There's clusters of them around Livingston Ave and around the French Street area. And what they do is every morning, if you wake up early enough, and I was up this morning, I actually visited some agencies, I'll talk to you about it later, what they do is they pile people into these vans or oftentimes buses, and they will ship them to warehouse jobs that are either further down the turnpike in sort of like the South Brunswick, David Monroe area, or in the Raritan Center area of Addison. Those tend to be the two big kind of destinations. These jobs, agencies we often think about as temporary jobs, but these jobs are anything but temporary.
Right. People go there every day.
Right, and we call them permatemps because of the fact that like these are people's full-time. They're working 40 hours a week, doing the same job at the same place for the same agency. And I think when we did some research on it, we found the average tenure in one of these jobs was 2 years. Right, that's a full-time job. they pay just they pay the minimum wage or maybe a hair above it, and there is absolutely no paid time off at all. And so for us, a key point of making a sick leave ordinance actually work for New Brunswick was covering these workers, because you're not going to leave out 1 out of 10 New Brunswick workers from an ordinance, particularly when they're the ones that need it most. And when you're thinking about sick time ordinance, you have to look at like prior rates of sick pay, and we know that prior rate of sick pay in the agencies is 0%. There is not one agency worker who had any paid time off prior to this ordinance. What the current the current discussion or dispute is about is that Working Families, an outside organization, has presented a petition via specific kind of municipal process, and a very official process,
could be
binding that's going to the ballot, that does not cover staffing agency workers who are employed outside the city of Brunswick. And their position on that has kind of varied a little bit. They came in first saying, our petition doesn't cover staffing agency workers employed outside the city of Brunswick. They won't accrue sick time. But based on our interpretation of the current New Brunswick law, we don't think the current New Brunswick law technically covers them. So technically, we're not taking rights away from thousands of people. That's an interpretation that only they themselves have. The city attorney has a different interpretation. They say, absolutely, these staffing agency workers who are employed by agencies in New Brunswick and transported out of the city are covered and do earn and accrue sick leave under our ordinance. All the city council members have said it, including Betsy Garlotti, who actually didn't abstain in the original vote. She actually voted no, and her stated reason was specifically due to this staffing agency coverage, right? So even opponents of the sick leave ordinance recognize what this staffing agency coverage does. Every single community group, New Labor, Esperanza, Unity Square, recognize that the current law covers these staffing agencies, as well as the reporting of New Brunswick Today highlighted the staffing agencies as a new and important wrinkle in the current New Brunswick law, as did El Reporte Hispano, which is the Central Jersey's kind of most prominent Spanish language newspaper, which actually ran a cover headline in their December weekly issue after the New Brunswick ordinance was passed. It said, "Agencies to pay sick days." So this position that Working Families has taken is they're alone in that position, right?
Well, but they're not, because there's also the Time to Care Coalition and other organizations, right? It's not just one out-of-city organization. There's a coalition. There's a number of organizations that share their position, right?
I think on the particular issue of the staffing agencies, let's be real, Charlie, there's only Working Families that's driving on this issue. They're the ones who highlighted this legal issue, and the other folks are kind of along for the ride. Now, their position actually has evolved, and was kind of humorous to watch humorous in a sad way to watch the city council meeting, because they went from saying, well, we don't cover staffing agency workers outside the city of New Brunswick, but I think based on a technicality, you don't either, which is far from like a pro-worker affirmative position, to saying to the city attorney and the city council yesterday, like catching them in the hall before the meeting, oh, no, it doesn't cover it, but you can amend the ordinance to cover them because we don't want to leave them out. To them saying, well, maybe if you interpret our law in a broad, favorable way, you can say that they're covered. That's kind of a bunch of malarkey, if you ask me. They don't know what they're proposing. What they're proposing, and what's unfortunately going to go to the ballot, is a petition that will take away sick leave rights for close to 2,000 people who currently have it, and only have it because they organized for it and won it if it passes.
Now,
period.
Now, does their petition explicitly say that temp workers are not going to be covered, or is it just silent on it?
Their petition says that that you accrue only for work done actually in the city of New Brunswick and does not include qualifying language that's included in the current law that talks about work done by staffing agency workers outside the city of New Brunswick. They even said themselves that was their original position, which they articulated at the council
So
meeting
they
3
removed
weeks ago.
they removed the language that matters so much to you and your folks that you're representing, and you're saying that they include a provision that says you only get the hours for work that's actually done in New Brunswick. But they said that part also in the law that you guys passed, so aren't they right when they say there is a technicality?
No,
or
because the reality is that anyone who takes a good faith reading of the current New Brunswick law realizes that that there is earned sick leave for agency workers. That includes everyone from the city who is involved in drafting it, who is involved in voting on it, even those who voted no on it, everyone who is advocating for it, everyone who's enforcing it, and guess what? Even the agencies themselves. Now, could the law have been strengthened so as to preclude Weasley arguments? Yes, but you don't make a law to prevent Weasley arguments, and frankly, I mean, maybe it should have, but I thought there were going to be Weasley arguments coming from the agencies. I mean, the agencies are notorious for trying to avoid requirements. You have the Manias who ran a staffing agency called Atlantis, committed workers' comp insurance fraud, thought that they could get away with it by closing Atlantis, opening up another agency in the same site called Olympus, and that would make it go away. So I mean, the reality is that this is like, if you're a pro-worker group and you're saying technically we're not taking rights away from you, even though, and most importantly, the agency workers themselves are the ones who are saying these are taking rights away from us, right? And these are folks who only got the rights because they fought for it and won. And so what's going to the ballot, to be very clear, is not a petition to cover all workers. It's a petition to take away rights currently held by staffing agency workers who work for agencies in New Brunswick and who are transported outside of city of New Brunswick, which, by the way, characterizes 99% of staffing agency workers, because there's only a handful of staffing agency workers that actually work at work sites in the city of New Brunswick. And extend sick leave to a group that's not any bigger, perhaps smaller, certainly more privileged, and frankly hasn't been a part of this discussion. I think that that's kind of interesting. We talk about, there's been like this per diem hospital worker question, which, I mean, listen, I think that there is room for improvement in the current law. And I think everyone, when they passed it, acknowledged that. This ballot process doesn't do that, right? It's not a process that spans coverage. But back to the question about workers, right? I mean, you've been to council meetings. Has there been a per diem hospital employee who's gone and talked in favor of the petition?
Well, not the petition, but I think there was a union representative that spoke out.
She was not representing hospital workers. That union representative was with the Rutgers Administrators Union. So there has not been. There has not been a worker who's gone in front of council and has, said, listen, this is my situation. I think that's the compelling way to make the case. And so I think that the ordinance should be improved. I think first of all it should be implemented, right? And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's critical. But this process with the ballot initiative is taking away rights from people and is not improving the ordinance, because if this is a process of incremental improvements, it locks the ordinance in the
that's the thing. We learned last night, or I learned last night,
right,
that if the council had voted yes last night and adopted the petition as law, it would become law, but they could change it almost right away if they wanted to, and they could change it back to your ordinance, or they could change it in any way they wanted immediately going forward. But because the council voted no 3-0 last night, the question's going to be put on the ballot, And if it passes, it will be locked in for 3 years, and you won't be able to change it to expand it or fix it or make any modifications to make all sides happy. So, are you happy with the verdict last night? You think the council made the right choice?
Well,
I was a little surprised.
here's what I would say. The advocates for the petition, and there was a whole discussion about the petition that I'm sure you're going to write about, right? Because there were questions raised about the validity of the petition by T.K. Shammy, the
Very
city
interesting
attorney.
conversation.
Very
about
interesting
that.
conversation, right?
Yes.
About the formal validity of the petition and potential, issues surrounding that, which I think, is perfect fodder for an investigative reporter to follow up on. There were questions about the fact that the official committee of petitioners, which is 5 New Brunswick registered voters, didn't even sign the petition, didn't even circulate the petition, right? And so, and there was no attempt to, there was no desire on the part of the groups to ask for amendments.
They didn't come to you before they circulated the petition. They didn't say, what's important to you guys here? What do you want in? What do you want to make sure you get in? You kind of got surprised by the petition.
Certainly. I mean, the effort for earned sick leave in New Brunswick was a community-driven effort. It was very public that launched over a year ago, where there were folks at council meeting, every single council meeting, for the better part of 7 months, giving testimony on this issue, talking about the importance of the agency.
It was excellent organizing, I'll give you that. But don't you think that if the folks who went and did the petition had been included originally, that they would have been more likely to include you when they were doing the petition? Do you think that? Do you have any regrets about how that went down?
I don't see how. I mean, the organizing for the earned sick leave was done publicly over the course of the year. This argument of being surprised, I think, is bull. I think your paper wrote numerous articles about it, or at least one, right, as it was moving forward. I think it was in April of 2015.
Right, and that's how they found out about it. And I think they're feeling.
That was in April. That was in April of 2015.
Oh no!
I mean,
you're talking about the summer.
And frankly, the reality is that there's a principle that I don't believe that working people who can speak for themselves, who can organize themselves, need to ask anyone's permission for advocating for themselves to their own local government in the way that they feel is the best way to do it. I think that's ultimately what's there. And going back to kind of the question of workers, there weren't any New Brunswick workers at the hearing that spoke against, in favor of the petition in any sort of compelling way. There was someone who I knew who's former New Labor member, who's 32BJ member. He kind of made some general comments about covering all workers. There's someone who, Mr. Garcia translate for, who actually was an agency worker, was talking about how messed up agency work was. He certainly wasn't arguing that he should lose rights that he currently had. And then there were a bunch of professionals for, advocacy groups. And listen, I think that every specific point, that there are very compelling arguments to be made for how for improving this ordinance as we implement it over time. I think that is the lesson that we learned from Jersey City, right? That they passed an ordinance that was a first step. It actually only provided paid sick days to people who worked for businesses that were 10 or more employees. They studied it after a year. After a year, they commissioned the study. They did this survey study, which was
it said even the employers liked it. It was even the employers found it.
That was sort of the headline of the study, right? I think it also found that very few people knew about the law, which is why I want to go back to implementation.
Sure, yeah, let's talk about that. You say that's the strength of your...
But just with Jersey City, right? They studied it, they got data on it. 2 years later, they decided to update it. I think that's sort of a good policy making process, right? And I think that as we're getting into the fact of realizing, hey, there's a lot of nuances here that kind of pushing something through on a ballot that the people who are pushing it don't even know how it's changing the existing law is a very kind of crude mechanism for having this conversation, this discussion. And I think everyone, when they voted for it in like the council members that voted for it in December, I mean, I think they all said like it's a start, it's a first step, and so that invites the possibility for continued engagement. But implementation, all right. So so yeah, I mean, you know, I think you noted in your comments that, you know, there's kind of questions about incentives or like forming different LLCs, but I can tell you from experience that the easiest way, if you're an employer and you don't want to comply with the law, to not have to comply with the law, is to hope that it's not implemented and don't tell your employees about it. And if you have a city agency that's not taking seriously their responsibility of educating, notifying businesses of the new requirements, of educating workers and residents, of partnering with community groups and educating workers, residents, and businesses, and then actually enforcing the ordinance. And that ordinance, you know, we could have all these hypothetical conversations about it covers this many people, it covers that many people,
Sure.
but if it's not actually implemented or enforced, it doesn't actually give anyone sick.
And you're saying
what we want.
the New Brunswick law has enforcement mechanisms and people in place to do that.
I think
Glenn
it's
Patterson
been,
was up at the
I think
last
it's
meeting.
been,
He said,
superb. Yeah.
he said there were 14 complaints
14
already.
complaints, which, so we did some over requests in January of this year, so it's a little bit dated, of the other municipalities that at the time had sick leave laws.
Okay, you wanted to see if they were enforcing it or if they
So-
were actually.
What we found, and you know with over requests, that sometimes municipalities can be, let's just say they can not facilitate the process as easily as
In
possible.
New Jersey?
Yeah. So
Oh.
we didn't push on the folks who got back to us, but on the ones who got back to us, which was the majority of municipalities, that we had counted 4 resolved complaints
In the whole
statewide.
state. Okay.
Statewide. Mr. Patterson reported that, you know, his office, under, you know, the great work that Maria Cody, the sick pay administrator, is doing, had resolved 14 cases.
Resolved 14 cases?
Or had investigated 14 cases, and
14
I think
complaints.
I'm privy to a number of those cases, and I would say probably the majority of them have been resolved. That I think, you know, shows the seriousness of it. Probably puts New Brunswick at the top or near the top in out of all the municipalities in New Jersey that have sick leave ordinances in terms of cases actually, you know, followed through on. And May, if the numbers that we got from January are consistent
Right,
or
probably more.
accurate, they might have more than all the other municipalities combined, and we're only 8 months into the law, and we're actually only 4 months into. May 5th. Yeah. We're only 4 months into
people
when you
being
can
able to
actually
use the days.
use
Yeah.
the days. Yeah.
So-
So I mean, I think that's really key.
Well, let's talk practical. November 8th, this is going to be asked of the voters. Paid sick leave, in general, is a very popular idea.
Right.
And, you know, voters are going to have other things on their mind that day. There's a presidential election.
Right.
There's a lot of other things going on.
Right.
Do you really think that there's a chance that this won't pass, or do you think it's?
I mean, the reality is that I don't think taking away paid sick leave from people who already have it and need it most is a popular idea. It might be popular with some sectors
Is
of
there
the
going to be
of
a
the
vote
Trump
no
vote.
campaign? Is there going to be a campaign to tell people that this, you know, that this is going to do more harm than good, or?
I mean, we're certainly going to do that. I mean, I think this is part of it, right? Maybe some Trump voters in New Brunswick will say this is a way to take away rights from immigrant workers and get excited about it. But I think that making the argument that, hey, we're going to kind of cover different people but take away sick leave from people who have it, and probably take away more, that's not really a compelling argument that's going to get people excited. So I think that from a moral or ethical point of view, I would like to not have it be on the ballot, because I don't think that you put people's fundamental livelihoods, taking away their sick leave. This is not about like coverage or how do we expand it. This is You have it today, you don't have it tomorrow on the ballot. And I think particularly given that, quite honestly, most of the folks who it's going to directly affect because of our country's immigration policies aren't going to have a vote in that process. And I think that that's a real ethical question that people have to look at. I think that if you're a typical voter and you say, listen, sick leave is hard, right? We want to find a way to make it work in New Brunswick, and we want to find a way to continue to improve on it, then voting no on this ballot initiative is the way to do it. Because one, you're not taking sick leave away from people. Two, you're not locking the city into a policy that really needs to evolve as we implement it and get feedback on it for 3 years. Because if it passes on the ballot, it's locked in stone for 3 years unless there's another special election effort that's launched. And so, I think that people are reasonable. I think that people don't want to take away sick leave from people who already have it and need it most. Particularly as school starting, these folks have kids, this will be the first time when they don't have to, send their kid to school sick or risk being fired because they'll have sick leave rights. People are not going to vote to take away. I mean, it's almost like saying, okay, we want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, but everyone who's currently making $8.38, you're going to start making $7, and everyone who's making 10 and above, you'll start making 15. Like, it doesn't make sense. It's a bad ordinance. It's an ill-advised policy, and that if you want, in good faith, to implement sick leave in New Brunswick and expand it, and not have it be about political agendas, but have it be about people actually getting sick leave, people who have these new rights actually understanding the law and being able to, yes, call out without fear when they're sick or their spouse is sick, then vote no on this ordinance, this ballot question, if it does ultimately go to the ballot, and let's organize together as a community. And I think that every elected official on the council would welcome that discussion. So
Okay, so you say if it's on the ballot, there's no question about it though. Now it's gonna be on the ballot, right?
So I think that there's one or two. Sorry, my wife's calling me. She thought I was gonna be on at 9 o'clock.
We thought so too.
So I think that there's still actually, I believe, a 9-day period when this committee of petitioners
Could
can ask to
withdraw.
withdraw it. And I would ask them. I've actually reached out, and I think it might be something that I follow through on. To ask them to consider doing that. I think that there are a whole host of questions about this policy and its effect on workers who are most exploited, losing their sick leave rights. That's a problem. I think that there are questions now being raised about the validity of the petition itself, which maybe you understand better than I do, but probably is not something you want to be personally associated with. And frankly, I mean, my impression is that these are folks who are kind of being dragged into this dumpster fire campaign because they thought in good faith they were going to cover everyone, but they're not. So in any case.
So, last question.
Right.
There was a potential to avoid this last night, or a potential compromise if the city would have allowed amendments to the petition, if they would have allowed the folks that put the petition forth to make some tweaks to it to ensure that it didn't mess up, the situation for temp workers. They said they were open to that. Was that something you had agreed to? Did you oppose that effort, or did you support that effort, or did you?
I mean, so I'll say two things. First is that the base of our objection is on the fact that the petition revokes rights from the temp agency workers, right? That's our objection. But that's huge, right? Particularly given the scale of that sector of employment in New Brunswick and how much these families are going to benefit from it. I think on that particular point, that, and I believe the city attorney kind of clarified it, but that when you submit an initiative petition, there's substantive changes and there's like minor changes or whatever.
Technical changes or
Technical,
whatever,
right,
yeah.
right. And
They
he
ruled
was
that
he
this
was
would be
of the opinion that it was
substantive,
substantive.
so
And I mean, like, I don't necessarily think that that's. I mean, I'm not an attorney, but I mean, it seems pretty substantive to me that.
But if that deal was on the table, would you
Well, the way that deal can be on the table is if the petition is withdrawn, so that it's not going to the ballot, and that there's working together, that there's an opportunity to work together on a compromise. But right now, I think
you would support that compromise if that was on this. They said we'll pull the petition if you support our things that we want, we'll support what you want. Would that be?
I mean, the nature of our objection was always, hey, you're cutting out not only cutting out, you're taking away currently held sick leave from staffing agency workers. I think though that the problem with this initiative process, as I understand it, is that like you basically have to have the whole ordinance written and stapled to the petition
Before you even get the
before you
signatures,
even
yeah.
go and get the signatures. So it's not a process for kind of figuring out nuance, right? And right now it's kind of like agency workers. I mean, I hate to use a metaphor of like hostages, but like they're going to lose their rights if the petition passes, right? So they're being held hostage by this process as long as it stands, right? And I mean, I think that we've always been open to improving the ordinance. We actually have been having conversations about it, but to be able to figure out how to improve the ordinance, you actually have to implement it. So a couple of things that we've learned, right, just with the implementation. There are a heck of a lot more people who work more than 40 hours a week than who are not hitting the 20-hour threshold. And so that can be a potential issue because if your typical work week is, say, 50 hours and your sick leave is capped at 40 hours a week, that
Might not
can
be
be sort of
enough
a
for-
challenge. And actually, if you look at Bureau of Labor Statistics stats, 75% or 74 point something percent of all workers work at least 35 hours a week. So that means 25% work less than 35. Only about 6 or 7% of workers work less than 20 hours a week, and 25% of workers work more than 40 hours a week. So you actually have an equal chance of working more than 40 hours a week as you do working less than 35 hours a week. So I would say like that's something that could be a potential improvement. I think that getting staffing agency workers the potential to accrue 5 paid sick days instead of 3 would be something that we would talk about. In addition to some of the proposals that are on the table. So it's all that to say that like listen, the way that you make these things better is you come together, you implement them, you actually help real people get sick leave, which I think is a key part. And I almost wish if we spent half as much time arguing about the minor details of the law than educating the public in implementing this and helping people file complaints when there are legitimate complaints would be a lot further along. And then you learn that and you take that with feedback. And then that feedback can have the discussion so that you're not talking about hypotheticals. You're not having someone else talk for workers who aren't present there. You have an actual experience of a person who's saying, this is my situation. This is how the current law falls short. Let's think of ways that we can address that. And I think that's the process that will yield the best outcome. And that's I think that's a continuation of the process that's already been started. And I think that the law can only get better, but I think it's also pretty darn good. It can also get worse though if staffing agency workers who now have sick leave lose it.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Jason
All right.
Rowe, for joining us. Jason, if there is an election, is on the vote no side. As we move towards the election, we'll give you both sides of the story, and voters are going to have an interesting and difficult choice to make on November the 8th. We also wanted to mention we learned that there's still a chance to avoid the election if the petitioners from the Working Families Alliance decide to withdraw that petition. And so what we just heard was Jason Rowe calling on them to withdraw their petition. So we'll keep you updated on the story, and of course, when it's officially on the ballot, we'll let you know. Thank you, Jason, for joining us.
Thank you.
Please join us again on Friday. We'll have another show for you. You can pick up our August issue of our phenomenal bilingual newspaper here, New Brunswick Today, available across the town and also online for free at newbrunswicktoday.com. Thanks again. We'll see you on Friday, and tomorrow we'll be at the tax board if you want to join us.
And try to have a new pair of sneakers.
New pair of sneakers, too. Thanks again.
All right. Hey, you're welcome.
Bye, everybody.